start. I'm Larissa Fast. I'm professor of humanitarian and conflict studies and the director of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this lecture. And I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment, but I also want to say that this is actually HCRI's first ever joint event with the law school here at Manchester. So it's the first joint law school HCRI event. Yeah, so we're delighted that this partnership is off to such a wonderful start with the arrival today of Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell, who is, in full disclosure, a former colleague of mine at the University of Notre Dame, where she is currently the Robert and Marion Short Professor of Law and also a Professor of International Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame. So her work is in the area of international law on the use of force, international dispute resolution, and the international legal theory. So she's the author of numerous books, including this one here, The Art of Law in International Community, published by Cambridge University Press, and also Self-Defense Against Non-State Actors with Tams and Talati,
new judge of the International Court of Justice.
Okay, also published by Cambridge. So she has a much longer CV, which I will not go into in part because I think she wouldn't want me to. Yes, but I'm delighted to welcome Mary Ellen here, and I'm very much excited to hear what you have to tell us about the laws of war.
Well, it is really great to be here. You all are so lucky to have Larissa Fast. She's an amazing scholar, just a wonderful human being. We miss her so much in South Bend. So when she said, you're going to be in the UK for a while, come and speak, I didn't hesitate. Plus, I think it's events like this, it's locations like this, it's places like this where we need to start the counter-revolution. And I've heard that the place to come to meet the revolutionaries is Manchester. So that's another reason I'm extremely glad to be here. And all of you out there online, you can be part of Manchester by association to this lecture. So the title, Attempting to Kill the Law of Peace. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sudan's civil war, and even more intensively, Israel's war in Gaza, international law discussions are full of commentary, arguing that international law is dead, or at the very least, damaged beyond repair. In these remarks, I'll explain that the law of peace endures, regardless of these horrendous violations. But true enough, the violations, and more directly, the attempts by governments to provide legal justification for these violations, do weaken the law's pull to compliance. And it is compliance with the law of peace that matters, not some zombie existence of the law itself. So I'm going to argue today that the current widespread failure to comply is linked to two intellectual streams: political science realism and international legal positivism. Improving compliance with the law of peace requires countering these thin concepts, in their way, both of them of recent origin. These are mere ideas thought up by a very few men, and it is long past time that we are free of them. With clarity about authentic law, we can encourage the modeling of law compliance by leading states, and social science research shows us that such modeling leads to emulation by others, and norm decline and even norm death can be reversed. We are witnessing this process in action right now. The process of norm revival is occurring. We saw it when South Africa, at the end of December, launched a case against Israel in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. South Africa took up the role of leading state. It is accurately articulating the law of peace and modeling compliance with it at the court. South Africa's case against Israel in the International Court of Justice is creating this change. not by funneling weapons to Palestinian armed groups or in any way projecting military power, but by invoking the law, including the prohibition on the use of force violated by Israel in Gaza. The social science research on reversing norm death assumes that the United States is the leading state needed to model law compliance, or maybe the UK. I suggest to you that modeling law compliance at a high level is what makes a state a leading state. South Africa's example shows the way to reverse the efforts of so many realist political scientists who intentionally, and positivist international lawyers who perhaps unintentionally seek to kill the law of peace. Let me proceed in 3 parts. I'll first explain briefly what constitutes the law of peace, and then I will discuss how political science realism emerged in the interwar period for the very purpose of suppressing this law. Lawyers aided their efforts by interpreting international law in a way that could fit the realist agenda, to the point that today no credible prohibition on the law of force even seems to exist. Yet, the international law of peace endures. That's my second point, and I'll explain to you why it endures despite this onslaught. Despite the success of these thin intellectual streams. And the final part will bring this social science research into play to show how to revive the weak state of the law of peace. Okay, first, the attempts to end international law prohibiting the use of force. The almost unimaginable loss and devastation of World War II, only 25 years after the devastation of World War I, led to the boldest initiative in history to prohibit the use of armed force and to mandate the use of peaceful mechanisms of dispute resolution. And these are the 2 components of the law of peace. The strict prohibition, the comprehensive prohibition on resort to military force, outlawing any initial resort to armed force, and the alternative, the counterpoint to that prohibition, the effective mechanisms of resolving disputes peacefully through negotiation, mediation, fact-finding, conciliation, arbitration, and adjudication before courts, national and international. The preamble of the United Nations Charter dedicates this institution to saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The drafters were serious about this aim, which so many international law and security scholars today simply find quaint. In the Charter's Chapter 1, the duty of all UN members to comply with all international law is spelled out. The prohibition on the use of force appears in Article 2, Paragraph 4. It codifies the natural law prohibition on resort to armed force passed down through the centuries, beginning with the ancient Greeks. The Charter's Article 2.3, even preceding the prohibition, provides the other side of the coin, the duty to use peaceful mechanisms for dispute resolution. Mechanisms also well known to us, honed over the centuries, and again, originating with the ancient Greeks. The UN era started well. The United States altered 175 years of foreign policy to finally join a multilateral organization. It was an entangling alliance that the very first US president, George Washington, warned his fellow Americans all about. He said, avoid such entangling alliances, which is why the US never joined the League of Nations. But the US finally committed, realizing that leadership was needed, emulation was needed to commit to the Charter, to the prohibition of the use of force, and to the mechanisms of international dispute resolution. And the US also finally joined and agreed to the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The US had infamously refused to join both the predecessor court and the League of Nations. And yet, I still today, having studied these facts for so long, I still marvel at how quickly the takedown happened. Attacks came on the law of peace. only established through this institution, through these codified ancient norms in 1945, the attacks were beginning already by 1950. As early as 1951, the prominent American diplomat George Kennan urged abandoning the quote unquote legalistic, moralistic approach that had been central to American foreign policy. He was a part of this new school of political science known as realism, a school of political theory that emerged in this country between the wars. There was a sometime academic and journalist named E.H. Carr, who was probably the chief architect of this devastating new theory. He wrote a book called The 20 Years Crisis, 1919 to 1939. And he states in that book that it's simply impossible to accept the international legal principle that states enjoy equal status before the law. He said there are just too many asymmetries of material power. Carr found that this idea of equality of states is a fiction, which contradicts the inherent logic of international politics, where the strength of the individual states had to be considered as a crucial factor in the solution of conflicts of interest. He had a narrow understanding of what a strong state is. He equated it primarily with the accumulation and possession of military assets. He saw the world as Thomas Hobbes did, another British political theorist of the 17th century, who saw human beings as essentially selfish, motivated ultimately only by their survival instinct, and that led them to seek to amass wealth and to even use physical coercion. Order among people for Hobbes is only possible through government coercion, and where no government exists, as in the relations between states, there's only war. A war of all against all. A scene of anarchy. Well, of course, human beings do have a survival instinct. We all know that. We all get hungry. We all seek food, shelter, the basics. We do tend to seek, and we know that there's even this attraction to amassing more than we need to survive, and to even use physical coercion to get even more. But everyone here also knows that we're so much more than that. The existence of law is a prime example of humanity's great capacity for good. We're capable of true altruism, doing actions that have absolutely no benefit to us, but are for the good of another, regardless of rewards for ourselves. Law contains and is built on that capacity. It's an idea only, something without material existence. And yet everyone here, I'm confident, would accept that they have legal obligations under the law that they will obey, even if they know they will never be held to account, that no policeman is going to arrest them. Well, Kennan and Carr, these heroes of realism, might not have succeeded against this alternative, this more complex reality of human nature, in launching this thinking that eventually undermined and put this pressure on today's law of peace, if it were not for one individual, Hans Morgenthau. Morgenthau was a German refugee to the United States during the Second World War. He was an international law scholar. He was probably a genius. He did as much as any one person to sink US and Western foreign policy into the anti-law myth of realism. Morgenthau had studied with the great Hans Kelsen in Germany. But even while there, even while being exposed to some of the greatest ideas of law, he made a turn to Carl Schmitt, another lawyer, a realist positivist. Morgenthau argued, along with Schmitt, that international law cannot really be respected in important matters of state. Perhaps domestic law exists, but not international law. Morgenthau could use the popular misunderstanding fomented by Hobbes that law can only exist within a state where there's a government coercing obedience. International law, in his opinion, lacked such coercive mechanisms, that could really enforce the law against a powerful state like the US. Therefore, the US must be free of legal restraint in military affairs. Reciprocal niceties like exchanging ambassadors or some trade in goods, maybe the law, international law is good for that, but not in military competition. And it is from Morgenthau and this kind of thinking that we have the one basis of all contemporary Western, NATO, foreign and security policy, the theory of deterrence. We possess nuclear weapons, we threaten to use nuclear weapons, we go to war, we try to justify preemptive uses of force, all from this realist idea that the law doesn't matter, the possession and the demonstration of military force does, the threat to annihilate all life on Earth somehow keeps us secure. We've seen plenty of social science research that has completely eliminated this theory of deterrence, and yet it hangs on. Why does it continue? Well, a lot was done to undermine the alternative, undermine the view that international law can be that bond that ties us all together, that brings true security, that the cooperative methods, the peaceful methods of resolving disputes will keep us all safe. This alternative intellectual push was doing two things. It was promoting this thin idea and undermining the ancient, rich idea of law. Schmitt, for example, made the very strong case that was believed by his Nazi overlords that British and American interpretations of international law were harming Germany, and that they should not be able to interpret law any more than Germany. Germany should make its own interpretations of law. And he did have a point. It should not have been the US or the UK determining what Germany should do from their own perspective. There should have been a common international orientation to the law. So in what the US and UK were modeling at that time, Schmitt was able to make this argument that we can all make our own law. If you're powerful enough of a state, you don't have to take the dictates of others. And that's one of the strong driving forces, driving ideas, along with this terrible idea of deterrence and belief in military force that these few men and this realist idea has foisted on us today. Well, it's so interesting to me. One of the reasons why these ideas are not finally removed, why they are believed and believed, they're still read, whereas the classics in international law are not. Carl Schmitt is still read assiduously. I understand that President Putin and Chairman President Xi both are devoted readers of Carl Schmitt. Do you realize that Hans Morgenthau's book, written first in 1948 and then coming out in many, many editions, is read by every American student of political science and international relations? I don't think there's another book in the whole academy in a particular field that's read by everybody. I don't even think in theology everyone reads the Bible. But every student of international affairs in the United States reads Hans Morgenthau, so that's what they're learning. That somehow deterrence works, that realism matters, that it's a real thing. Schmitt's and Morgenthau's radical thinking still might have remained on the margins, but it was taken up by international lawyers. Not only is it constantly read, but international lawyers themselves jumped in to the fray. They set out to serve government officials who had become convinced by realism that it was essential, even a moral duty, to project military force, in line with the thinking of Hobbes and Carr and Kennan. Marty Koskiniemi, our great Finnish international law theorist, describes how Morgenthau collapsed international law into realist international relations when he arrived in the US. So with this powerful dynamic occurring in political theory, a trend developed in international law out of fear of obsolescence. Better to give some sort of legal fig leaf to uses of force or risk being ignored entirely. So there's a dual problem going on for international lawyers. If they want to be close to power, they better say what the powerful want. There's some careerism in this. And of course, they're also beginning to think, it must be all realism. It must be all about the use of force. So if we want any law, it's got to be adaptable to accept this. To accept that military force is going to be used. Let's keep some law in it. Let's make sure it's not abandoned entirely, does some good. And they thought they were doing something acceptable. The lawyers who really began this process of reinterpreting these fundamental norms that were part of the UN era, they begin already in the 1950s. They're part of this early attack on the law of peace. And two of them that really stand out are from this country. One was my good friend Ian Scobie is my professor. We were in the same class in Cambridge University, 1981-82, being taught by Derek Bowett, who at the time he was a reader in international law at the University of Manchester, took the lead in international lawyers making common cause with the realists to undermine the law of the Charter. Even before Bowett, there was a lecturer at Leeds named Julius Stone, who was a harsh critic of the UN. He wrote a piece, an opinion piece in 1950 about the new organization with the title, A Mad Hatter's World Tea Party. He's a professor of international law, reader in international law. Soon after the op-ed, he put forward an interpretation of the prohibition on the use of force in the Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4, that functionally eliminated its restrictions on a state's right to use force. He published a book defending Israel's attack on Egypt during the Suez Crisis, asserting that Article 2.4 really only restricted a state using force when it's aiming at territorial integrity or political independence, but that if you want to grab a canal, use all the military force you want. How could that be? How could that be attractive? Well, of course, the UK was involved in that. So in this country, there were some who were very attracted to that idea. Stone took as his starting place not Article 2.4, but the article on self-defense, the limited, narrow article on self-defense. But Stone cast the right of self-defense in the Charter, this narrow right, as a permissive right, as a tool to seek justice rather than an exception to a general prohibition. Now, Harvard Law School's Louis Sohn, who was himself a refugee from the Nazis, he managed to get out of Poland on the last ship carrying civilians before the Nazi invasion. He responded to Stone. He had been at the San Francisco conference to draft the UN Charter. He is credited with drafting Article 51. A young graduate student at Harvard drafted this principle to make it as narrow as possible. And Sohn, who was a great man, said we must look at Article 2.4 as comprehensive, as prohibiting all use of force. You need to read it in light of the Charter as a whole, read it in light of the negotiating history. This was the core principle to end war for succeeding generations. You can't use military force to grab a canal just because you're not interested in actually taking over the country. Sohn was a huge proponent of peaceful settlement of disputes, of the mechanism to peacefully settle, to get states to comply with international law. But our professor too, Derek Bowett, he began his attack on international law over the same issue, Suez. His 1958 book on self-defense seeks to expand the Charter restriction on resort to force so that an operation to defend the UK's role in collusion with France and Israel to attack Egypt, to grab back the canal from Nasser. He wrote this book as an ex post justification for that use of force by the UK. But notice it was also a very useful argument for the UK to use force to defend the empire more generally, which it did for a number of years until it kept losing and losing. Louis Hankin at Columbia Law School, he left before the Second World War. sometime after the First World War. His family fled what is today Belarus. He became professor of international law at Columbia Law School, and he called this argument of Bowett's a pernicious doctrine. It's a proposition that is persistent with a negative influence on the prohibition on the use of force. It reflects the realist faith in the utility of military force and takes as a given that politicians will ignore the law unless it supports their policies. Bowett was also countered by a man who would become the titular professor of public international law in Oxford, Ian Brownlee. But Brownlee's counter was not grounded thoroughly enough in the intellectual sources of law. Not like Lauderpact in Cambridge, who had pushed back against Morgenthau and said international lawyers have to understand the importance of natural law. They can't go with just this positivism that Morgenthau is pushing. They have to understand human nature as capable of this generosity that allows for true law. But neither Brownlee or Lauderpact or Hankin or Soane were able to stop this drive in US and UK's foreign and security policies so that by the end of the Cold War, they were thoroughly realist. Law against war, law for peace was simply being reinterpreted to suit realist policy. Well, I could give you so many more examples between Suez and today, but I'll just focus on the current moment. I'll fast forward to President Joe Biden, who persistently orders military attacks, currently on Houthi targets, but persistently since his presidency began in Somalia, in Syria, in Iraq. He orders these air attacks, citing the newest of these realist interpretations of the law of peace, a pure fiction, the thinnest of fig leaves. And it was invented again in the United Kingdom. In 2006, another sometime British academic named Daniel Bethlehem joined an effort to draft what is known as the Chatham House Principles on International Law on the use of force and self-defense, as if we needed new rules on the use of force and self-defense, as if the charter wasn't enough. The project sponsors wanted to develop principles on self-defense, providing more flexibility than those we find in the charter. That's the explanation. One of the proposed principles which Daniel promoted following the publication of the Chatham House Principles purports to allow states, United States, to attack non-state actor armed forces on the territory of another state when the US decides that that territorial state where they live is unable or unwilling to control them. Now I ask you, what does that mean? What does it mean that the state's unwilling or unable to control them? Which state is not trying to control non-state actor armed groups on their territory? I'm still puzzled by this. But this argument has appeared in no fewer than 3 of the US's formal letters to the UN Security Council reporting its legal basis for attacking and killing people in countries abroad. Bethlehem wrote when he was promoting unable, unwilling, that it had to be recognized as law, or the West would abandon it because it was not to do so, to try to follow Article 51 as written, the charter as written would be unrealistic, and these governments would walk away from the law. Well, many people think that's exactly what's happened. It's a major part of the reason why our colleagues in the Global South, this argument, unable, unwilling, self-defense whenever you want it, is part of the reason our colleagues in the Global South tell us that there is a double standard on the use of force, that the West holds itself to one standard and expects everyone else to comply with the charter. They call it a double standard, but since Gaza, they're saying there's no standard at all. It's just gone. But it's not gone. A central fact about the prohibition on force is that it is a peremptory norm of jus cogens. Peremptory norms prohibit certain highly immoral conduct, including genocide, torture, slavery, and the use of force. International law prohibits any derogation from these norms, any derogation. States may not create new treaties, or, I submit to you, new legal interpretations of existing treaties that contradict or dilute these norms. Peremptory norms are not subject to contraction because they're not subject to, and they are not made, and they do not emerge from the consent-based legal processes that produce treaties or rules of customary law. Natural law principles like the prohibition on force and torture and genocide are principles that we discern, that judges and scholars discern through the application of their reason, observation of the natural world, and their openness to the transcendent sources of knowledge that are described in philosophy, ethics, and faith traditions. Natural law is the only credible source of peremptory norms that cannot be changed through these reinterpretations or through consent-based processes. Despite its critical role, or maybe because of it, natural law has been suppressed for decades. It's once again returning to mainstream legal theory. We're beginning to understand, perhaps on the heap of destruction wrought by weak positive law interpretations, that our law is not making sense, it's not attracting compliance without an understanding of its true complex nature, which includes natural law. Remember that law is a concrete expression of transcendent norms. That's what it is in essence. It's not a science, it's not even a social science. It's a feature of social life. It's open to study by social scientists, but law per se is best categorized with the human pursuits associated with the humanities, with art, music, literature, religion, theology, philosophy. These are all areas of intellectual endeavor invented by people. So is the law. The discernment of transcendent norms in natural law is like the discernment of music or poetry. It occurs through human reasoning, incorporating non-material sources of knowledge. Social scientists and humanists alike all tell us that law is a social phenomenon. It's a complex, intricate aspect of human culture. It is also a normative social practice for guiding human behavior, giving rise to reasons for action. Legal historians using social science methods were joined by sociologists and anthropologists in investigating the origins of law. And the earliest indications are that law's origin is part of humanity's search for harmonious order. These anthropologists and legal historians found that law offers us, and I quote, a body of rules by which controversies are adjusted peaceably. It's through law that we find and we are able to order and prevent this very violence of one individual against another, one group against another. It's uniquely through law that we regulate that tendency toward coercion, toward violence. Later, after these early origins of how we are going to seek to balance our tendency to be selfish, to accumulate for self, even using violence, with our ability to be humane, with our ability to be compassionate and altruistic. From these early origins, the far more sophisticated Greek Stoics tell us that they're seeing this idea of order in nature everywhere. It is universal. The Stoics tell us that order is pervasive in nature, and they conclude that law, this idea of human beings, is a means of establishing order, and it must be a universal means. We must see it as something universal, shared by all humanity, and therefore, the Stoics are the first who tell us international law, of course, is possible. They developed what's been called a radically cosmopolitan, universalist vision of law, and isn't that what international law is? It was a Roman Stoic and jurist named Cicero, who during a period of philosophical eclecticism in the first and second centuries BCE, who introduced how we were going to build on this universal idea to find particular substantive norms and the premises of law in natural law. So he introduces the idea of using transcendent inspiration to lead us, using our reason to these more concrete aspects of natural law. Cicero is the one who discusses and shows that all law has to be this amalgam, this combination of both positive law principles that we create through consent and natural law principles that we discern, because it's the natural law principles that tell us the basis of positive law. The consent to a contract, to a treaty, is binding because of our understanding of the obligations we owe to another when we make a promise. That's not a legislated aspect, that is a natural law aspect discerned through our observations of nature, our use of reason. These processes provide for expressions of consent, which is the sine qua non of positive law, and explains why positive law is known as voluntary law, whereas natural law is known as the necessary law. Our wonderful colleague, predecessor to Ian at the University of Glasgow, Tony Cardy, understands this essential role and need to understand natural law so thoroughly, but he is in despair. He sees our contemporary international law as so dominated by pragmatic positivism, he does not think we will make any progress toward revitalizing international law through a new appreciation of natural law theory. But he inspires me because he shows how much natural law is woven throughout international law. That he makes the compelling demonstration that we law professors have to teach natural law. We have to understand it. We have to help people accept it. This truth is finally coming home to international legal theory, as the failures of positivism alone, without this context of natural law, is showing. Its openness to manipulation, its increasing association with devastating outcomes, war, climate collapse, and so on. Today's natural law revival that some of us are engaged with parallels in some respects an earlier Renaissance. Natural law reemerged following a period of suppression. It really only begins to be suppressed in the 19th century with the rise of science, but even more, the interest of European states and the US in acquiring colonies, which required a theory of unequal states. Some have more power than others, and that could only be created through a positive law interpretation, suppressing the natural law of equality. So after the Second World War, some of the best minds, legal minds, understood that the suppression of natural law had helped lead to the Nazis. The German legal theorist Gustav Reibruck made the case that positive law, shorn of any connection to natural law, had played a significant role in the rise of the Third Reich. The impact of suppressing higher ethical principles from regulating and limiting positive law became obvious in the legal system of the Third Reich. Even one of the firm anti-natural law theorists of the 20th century, Kelsen, admitted that the prohibition on the use of force is incorporated in UN Charter Article 2.4 as a natural law norm. He accepted that neither consent nor persistent violation can terminate it. But by the late 1950s and the start of the Cold War, this suppression of natural law was on again. The rise of realism. The Soviet Union and the United States and their lawyers are beginning to see that natural law doesn't let them control the world. They can manipulate positive law, not natural law. And they began at the international law conferences, like the conference in Vienna for the law of treaties, to reject any hint that there's natural law in the world. And they continue to do that in international law venues today. positive law, in contrast to natural law, is open to change through practice and interpretation. The US has attempted to base some of its wildest use of force interpretations, and even to invent something new, which you might have heard about, a whole rival system to contemporary international law, known as the Western International Rules-Based Order, full of rules created by the US, the UK, Australia. The Australians are very keen on this new order. I don't know why. But they have so manipulated Article 2.4 and Article 51 of the Charter that they think that's completely open to their manipulation. In one case, a US State Department legal advisor during the George W. Bush administration tried to generate his own evidence of state practice. The US has used this manipulation to try to justify its program of targeted killing, which I already mentioned. But two of my own contributions to this renewed work and interest in natural law offers both a secular way to enter into the discernment, into the understanding of what transcendent knowledge brings to the law through aesthetic philosophy, but also a very strong rejection that interpretation, that reinterpreting a treaty, interpretation like a new treaty in derogation of a Jus Cogens norm, reinterpreting a treaty that is consistent with Jus Cogens, with peremptory norms, that's equally prohibited by natural law. And these interpretations being foisted on us by members of the rules-based international order are simply invalid. Okay, that brings us to the remedy. We've got natural law. We've got some basis for saying, for believing that the prohibition on the use of force and the mandate to settle disputes peacefully exists, even if it's clearly being ignored by states with major militaries. We can reverse that. Social science and international research on improving compliance with international law gives us two concrete steps to take. The first is to be clear on what the law requires, clarity. Having a clear understanding of the rules already invites and creates an atmosphere of compliance. And the second is modeling. Okay, first, clarity regarding for modeling, for the second step to work, you have to be modeling accurate law. Yeah, the US models a lot of law on the use of force in violation. So you need to have, because it thinks that what it's doing in terms of reinterpreting law is sufficient. No, it has to be authentic law that is being modeled to renew this attraction, this pull to compliance. It requires clarity about and acceptance of the fundamental norms at issue. Harvard Law School's Roger Fisher, which some of you involved in conflict resolution, conflict response, he helped start the Harvard program on negotiation. He argued persuasively about the link between rule clarity and compliance. He and several other international law scholars working in the 1980s and 90s confirmed that uncertainty about the law helps drive non-compliance. It undermines respect. Compliance suffers. And frankly, I can't think of a rule that invites more unclarity, confusion than unable and unwilling. As a result of unclarity, fewer parties are willing to pay the cost of enforcement. We're watching this with regard to Ukraine. Look at the support for Ukraine, clearly the victim of a violation of the UN Charter. Support was never as high as it should have been, and it's falling all the time. There's confusion about what the law really requires. Lack of compliance follows from lack of understanding what a rule requires. The prohibition on force was well understood as of 1990. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, a very similar law violation to Russia invading Ukraine, the entire world came to Kuwait's defense. It took 100 hours of combat, 100 hours. And Kuwait was free and is still free. Look what we lost in the Cold War period through this confusion, through this realist mantra of using and projecting military force at will. Thomas Frank, NYU, wrote in similar terms. He developed this theory of legitimacy to explain obedience to rules. He observed that compliance results when legal principles reflect certain characteristics, such as being determinate and coherent. When such principles emerge from acknowledged sources of law, they're perceived as legitimate and they attract willing obedience. Abe Shays and Antonia Shays, also of Harvard, agreed with Fisher and Frank and observed that rules perceived as ambiguous fail to attract voluntary compliance. In addition to clarity, Tom Frank tied compliance to a community's understanding of the legitimacy of the rules. He wrote, the legitimacy of a rule or rulemaking or rule-applying institution is a function of the perception of those in the community concerned that the rule or the institution has come into being endowed with legitimacy, that is the result of a right process. Frank emphasized the link between compliance with international law and legitimate process of creation. We can re-emphasize the legitimate process of the creation of Article 2.4 and Article 51 of the UN Charter. We can go back to the black letter rules and the negotiating history. That was a right process. Chatham House is not. Tom Frank used the memorable term. He's the one who invented pull to compliance from these clear rules and explained how to enhance it. The greater pull is exerted by principles that have benefited from clear explanation by scholars and practitioners who understand natural law and international law's system of rule formation. Tom and I were on a panel together years and years ago in Vancouver, and he defended my very first steps out into a public forum to say we need to take natural law seriously. One advantage of the prohibition on the use of force is that because it is a natural law norm, it cannot be eliminated through contrary action, violations, reinterpretation. So our building of respect does not need to start at square one and recreating a rule. It can start now. Reestablishing the clear meaning of the prohibition is the key. When Russia invaded Ukraine, ongoing use of terrorism by non-state actors, civil wars, Israel's war in Gaza, they're all evidence that the UK, US, Australia's post-Cold War approach to international law and the use of force has failed. But recovery is possible. So we've set out one plank, clarity. In addition, we need modeling. During the 1990s, social scientists took up the topic of norm creation in the wave of post-Cold War liberal enthusiasm for human rights. They invented terms like norm cascade. That work continues, but a small group of social scientists later took up a related idea of examining norm decline. I include Rebecca Sanders' scholarship on the efforts in the US to construct plausible, if invalid, justifications as part of this norm decline research. The direct research on norm decline shows that compliance with legal principles erodes when states breach them in the face of only minimal negative consequences. The erosion is exacerbated when non-complying states get away with it, then others start emulating. Norms regress when an influential actor violates a norm while facing no change in their status. I mean, the US replete. I can name, the US has only fought one major war after the Second World War lawfully. The liberation of Kuwait. You know how many unlawful ones, and yet many around the world consider it a leading state. So this can trigger non-compliance cascades in which other states also start violating the norms. It's part of my theory of why Russia thought it could get away with invading Ukraine. The US does it, we can too. After persistent lack of compliance by one or multiple states, in particular influential states, others become inured to the law violation. For one author, a norm loses salience in the international arena through a process of emulation by leaders of other states who note that the normative stigma for breaking the norm is reduced. Logically, though, If norms can die when a leading state models law violation, they can recover through the same process. We did this after World War II. The norms were on their knees. And for a time, if all too short, they were revived. Much of the talk in international law today is on accounting for the past. There's an emphasis on criminal trials and reparations. There are calls for the US to admit wrongdoing. Indeed, it might be a barrier to leaders actually moving toward law compliance for fear that they'll be sent to the World Court, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I think this is all not helping move the world to true norm compliance. Maybe this accountability fascination is impeding reform. What's really needed is to show that what we really need is modeling of true norm compliance, the basic norms, the prohibition on the use of force by states. The West's creation of its own rules and its own club of privileged state has done so much to undermine respect for the rule of law. And I would say, not just abroad, but at home as well. The course charted here makes sense ethically and pragmatically for the future of law against war. And South Africa is leading the way, a way that I want to see emulated. All of you here at the University of Manchester and you who have joined us online to the University of Manchester can participate in this work. You can make this happen. You can make it your goal to understand the flaws of political science realism, to learn what authentic international law is, positive and natural, to use social science method to build the models of law compliance. In other words, you all can be part of the work to reverse the damage done by that reader in international law at this university in the 1950s, Derek Bowett, and build the law of peace once again. Prove it is not damaged beyond repair. Thank you.